Welcome back to another American history video. In this one, we're going to look at the hardship and the suffering during the Depression, since we already looked at the causes of the Great Depression. In this video in particular, we're going to look at compare and contrast how city dwellers versus rural farms dealt with the Depression, how the Depression took a toll on the American family in a few ways, mentally, physically, and then psychologically. And then how did Hoover respond to these challenges of the people both in the cities, in the rural areas, and then to the American family. So first, let's start with the cities. In the cities, there's a high concentration of people, and as a result, that's where the highest amount of unemployment are going to be. And so when people start to lose their jobs, they lose their house. And as a result, they make these makeshift shacks that you can see here out of scraps. And these are kind of a better example here of what they could be. In the front here, you see like an actual window in the house. In the back here, you see a better example. They make basically a shack out of things like cardboard, spare metal that they may rummage from a company. It's not common to find them made out of wood that was thrown away. And these are called shanty towns because they are basically a town within a town. They also then become known as Hoovervilles because the public gets very upset with President Hoover, and as a result, they use this name derogatorily towards him as a way to express their anger. In the cities, you also have the idea of the soup kitchen first popping up. It offered free or low-cost meals to the poor, and this was an alternative to digging through the trash. And you can see here in this picture, this is an example of a soup kitchen, and then at the same time, this is an example of a bread line, which we'll talk about here. Bread lines were the then lines of people waiting for food or donations from an organization. So you have organizations at this time who maybe have wealthy benefactors or who are doing things to get donations. This is where they really pull their resources for the poor especially. And then it's important to know that minorities were having an increasingly difficult time, especially blacks and Latinos, and there was a rising tension in the cities from the unemployment, which led to greater problems. In the rural areas, life was more difficult in the fact that it was more labor intensive, so every day you'd have to be working on the land. But the farmers could grow their own food. So in the cities, you had the problems of, people not having enough food, having to scrounge for food. In the farms, people have enough food. They don't have the other resources that they need. As a result of falling food prices, many farmers are forced to go into debt. This falling food price continues from 1919 to the end of the war, all the way into the Great Depression. The food prices keep falling. Farmers are unable to pay their mortgage, and as a result, during this 3-year period, about 400,000 farms were foreclosed on. And this is actually not good because the banks don't want these properties. They want the cash from the mortgage. So not only are farmers left without places to farm, the farmland's not being farmed, so there's less food, which makes the cost go up. And then the banks are saddled with all this property they don't want. They just need the cash. And so many farmers then turn to what's called tenant farming, which is where you pay a big farmer who owns maybe thousands of acres rent to farm a portion of it. But no one made any money doing that. Only the big guys did it, who made money. So, again, farmers who we already talked about in the Roaring '20s were the most disadvantaged. They continued to be disadvantaged in the Great Depression. Then, if problems couldn't get any worse, you have the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl started from a drought in the Great Plains, which is this area here, in the early 30s. And then, because farmers in this area were using tractors, they were cutting the tops of the grass off. So they were cutting away all the prairie grass in order to plant large fields of product. However, because they had been planting product for so long, the fields got dilapidated, meaning all the nutritional value that makes plants grow well was depleted from the soil. It was gone. Then you have the drought that comes in this area. And then on top of that, you have a wind that comes. And the wind is coming in this direction. It's picking up all of the dust that's on the top of the land right here. And then it's blowing it to the east. So the Dust Bowl is affecting this entire red dotted line area. The worst affected of the group, you can see, is this high red area where the dust swarms over the people in the states like Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado. These dust storms were huge, destroyed farmers' crops, did a lot of damage to houses, and really took a toll on farmers who were already struggling and damaged a lot of crops for the country that already didn't have enough crops to go by. And this Dust Bowl doesn't just last a little bit, it ends up lasting 3 years. So it really, for a portion of 3 years, ruins the crops and makes it hard for the farmers to continue to keep up. So what's it like for the families? Well, in this time, family life starts to change. Remember, in the 1930s, we have the decade of indulgences, 1920s. But because no one had money to go out to clubs or spend money on alcohol or go to shows, families began to cope by staying at home. They played board games, which became really popular. This is when actually Monopoly comes out. Then you have families listening to the radio because it's inexpensive to listen to the radio, so you have a series of radio shows that are developing. For the men, they have a difficult time because for the longest time, they were the providers of the family. And now many of them are lost without jobs. Some, as a result, left their families entirely. And you have a rise in the population of hobos. So men, mentally have a really hard time dealing with the stress of not providing for their family and doing what society told them they should do. Women had a hard time in that they were the runners of the house. They canned the food, they sold clothing, they banded together, anything they could do to save some money. In the meantime, they also had to raise the children, take care of the household, and some even were lucky enough to have a job outside the home. But women, don't forget at this time, were paid less than men. So even though they may have had a job, they weren't making as much. And finally, many say that women had it easier because you didn't see them begging in the soup lines. If you go back to that picture we talked about at the soup kitchen and the bread line, you see mostly men. And this is false because while men were on the streets begging or looking for jobs, women had all of the responsibilities at home and had to take on more responsibilities. So they didn't have it easier. They probably had it just as hard. And then finally, the children. Because there wasn't a lot of food, you have really poor diets. Many lack the food they need, and so they're malnourished. As a result of people not paying their taxes because they don't have jobs, the government doesn't have enough money to pay for schools, so they had to shorten the school day or cancel school at all for children. And this may sound great to you as you're in the middle of doing your homework, but this means that kids can't go to college, they can't get a better job, there's nothing for them to do but stay in poverty without school. And as a result, some decide to leave their families and ride freight cars across the country, which became somewhat popular in the fiction of the 1930s. But this was very dangerous, and actually 27,000 children died from riding freight cars across the country. They were murdered, or they died of not having enough food or whatever. So you can see all three of the categories here really suffered. Physically, they didn't have enough food. Mentally, they had to prepare themselves for living in poverty. There was also a series of psychological effects. The Depression killed the American spirit that we had been building up from the war of World War I and into the 20s. The men especially had to struggle with not being able to support their family. And remember, men at this time were supposed to be super macho. They were the ones supposed to make the money, take care of their family, and now they couldn't. So they had to not only deal with the stress of not having enough money, but they had to deal with the stress of being not successful, not being able to do the one job society told them they should do. As a result, you have a high increase in suicides. You also have a high increase of people getting admitted to asylums. People also had to give up on their dreams. Like I said, with kids not going to school, they couldn't go to college. A lot of people had to put having families on hold, or if they wanted to have 4 kids, maybe they had to stop at 2 because they couldn't afford to have any more. And then people had to give up going to things that we take for granted, like going to the doctor or the dentist, because they didn't have the money to pay for those services. So they gave up on their health, kind of, which is very sad, but it was a reality of the Depression. You also had some positives as well. People banded together. They were so kind. When people could, they donated food or clothing to others. You really have the country coming together for the first time in a long time, being, kind to one another and helping each other out. I just want to take a second to mention this picture here. This is the most famous picture of the Depression. It's this woman with her 2 children. They're in the Dust Bowl. You can see how dirty they are from the dust being in the air. And this picture just symbolizes the stress a mother during the Depression had to go to. She's worried about everything from keeping her children clothed to alive to fed. And really, you can see in the face, she is so much older than she actually is, because this stress has just worn on her. And this is really symbolic of all the parents during the Great Depression. And so Hoover has a philosophy. It's called rugged individualism, and that's what he calls it. And this is the idea that those who work hard will succeed. And he uses this phrase here, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, meaning those who work hard and really come up from nothing will be able to succeed. And that's based on his philosophy. He was an orphan as a kid and put himself through college, ended up going to Stanford, and really became this very smart, very intelligent man who made a lot of money. And that's reflected in this theory here. Unfortunately, people didn't really have the opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps because there was nowhere for them to go. And so as a result, he had this political philosophy that he was against welfare of any kind, and that people should really just improve their own situation and not rely on the government whatsoever. Do not rely on the government. And so he didn't offer assistance. As a result of being, very pro-business, very individualist, he was very cautious to provide any assistance to the people. He also tried to bring together various industry leaders to create a plan to improve the economy, but this failed. It made really no progress. And so the only thing he could really do was to reassure Americans that this was just part of the normal business cycle. And the business cycle works like this. You're going to have some peaks, and then you're going to have some troughs, meaning this is the low part of the economy here, and he's just saying this is a normal cycle. It happens all the time. It still happens today in business, and he tried to reassure Americans it's not a big deal. We're going to get out of it. He didn't really, I think, understand the gravity of the situation. So what's Hoover's response? Well, he builds the Boulder Dam, which becomes later the Hoover Dam, which employs young men. It brings water to Southern California and controls flooding. So you have this public works project here. You also have the Federal Home Loan Banking Act, which in 1932, remember this is 3 years after the Depression started, it lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farms. Meaning, if people were having trouble paying their mortgage, this act helped them to keep their house and delay their payments or spread them out so the banks could keep making money and the people could keep their house. Then he also had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which authorized $2 billion in emergency relief for banks, insurance companies, utility companies, and this would pay the companies directly, and then in the hopes that they would hire more people, they would give money to their stock, their stock price would go, and this would then trickle down from the very top to the average Joe here. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way, and people get very frustrated. It just kind of, the money sits in the accounts of these companies. And so this doesn't go over really well either. Then the worst thing that happens to Hoover's image is that in 1932, 10 to 20,000 World War I veterans arrived in D.C. to support a bill. And this bill would give them the bonuses they were supposed to receive. The bonuses were supposed to be over a period of time, and instead they were going to receive a lump sum of $500. The idea that if the soldiers got this money, they would then spend it in the economy that would spur businesses to grow, hire people, so it would be an easy way to, throw money into the economy, and the soldiers were already promised it. But the bill fails in the Senate, and Hoover then decides it's time to force the army to go home. Previously, before the bill failed, he had sent out food for them. He sent out scraps from the White House so they could build a shanty town right in front of the White House. After the bill fails, though, Hoover decides that the army's got to go. These veterans can't stay in D.C. anymore. But the veterans decide they're not leaving. And so what does Hoover do? He sends out Dwight Eisenhower and General MacArthur with more troops to clear the area. As a result, they throw gas in the air, and it ends up killing 4 people. One of them was a kid, and one of them was an infant. This draws so much negative attention, Hoover is never able to recover from this, and his image as a president is tarnished. He also has no support of anyone. So, what did we learn today in this segment? Well, we learned that city dwellers had the problems that they had to create their shanty towns. They lost their houses, they had no food, and so they relied on things like living together, working together, food pantries. Rural farmers, however, were able to farm at home, but they were losing their farms at an increasing rate. Then you have the toll of the American family. Mentally, physically, psychologically, the Depression took a toll on the men, the women, and the children. And then finally, you have Hoover, who's very hesitant to do anything in the Great Depression because he believes that America's going to get out of it by strong-willed individuals. Remember, they're going to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. This doesn't really happen, though, and so when he tries to make reforms, it's too little too late, and he really hurts his reputation with the bonus army. And that kind of kills his campaign and the Republican-controlled Congress. As a result, people are going to overwhelmingly vote in Democrats in office in the next election, which we will talk about in our next video segment. So that's it for now, Husky historians. Until next time.